to make it a better place to live for everyone. GE, imagination at work.
All right.
Okay, she's standing by waiting for your instruction.
Okay. And now again, our opportunity to ask a few more questions. If you'd like to make your way to the microphone, again, you can direct it to one person or the group as a whole, and you do not have to wait for me to call on you. Go ahead and tell us your name and where you're from.
I'm State Senator Ross Tolleson, Chairman of the Natural Resource Committee in the Senate here in the state of Georgia. I'll try to get to a question out of this in a minute. I would like to say on diversity issue with ethanols or any other kind of energy sources that we come up with, I think that's kind of key to making a real impact on the energy crisis that we have. In the state of Georgia, not only the gentleman that is building the corn ethanol plant down in Camilla, which I commend the corn ethanol people. Yes, it may be an expensive energy source today, but maybe as we go into the future with technology, we can decrease the cost of the unit to sell. The corn ethanol, we also have soon groundbreaking on a wood fiber ethanol plant in the state of Georgia. Be the first in the nation there, rapidly approaching. We are also turning used or out-of-date soft drinks, concentrates, orange juices into ethanol, which will be in production in the state of Georgia before the end of this year. That plant will be producing. So we're very diversified in the state of Georgia. Earlier, talking about the political will in the country, the political will in the state of Georgia is alive and well of helping to move forward on creating different alternative sources of energy. And I think Georgia may end up being probably the most diversified leader in the country within the next 12 months. Give me your thoughts on diversification of the energy sources. What have you seen across the country, or what are your thoughts on that? Any of you?
I'll start on that.
Go ahead, Nick.
Senator, appreciate the comments. You know, we often talk about, in particularly the Southeast, in these models, the destination models, as a starter home. You know, it's vitally important today, the corn ethanol industry is, but just was at a presentation last week, and Georgia was mentioned as a state having 24 million acres of commercial forests, and that potential being this individual threw it at 5 billion gallons. And so to have a plant in Camilla, Georgia, up and running, and infrastructure starting to be built to handle ethanol, certainly as that technology would become available, there are opportunities there with that starter home. So that's important, number one. You know, Georgia is very diversified, as you said. It was actually just featured nationally a couple weeks ago with Max Armstrong and Orion Samuelson on a program called Agribusiness. And what those folks had mentioned was 2/3 of the counties in this state, their number one economic driver is agriculture. And so any feedstock that we can use, be it wood chips or wood-based, be it some amount of the corn cob or corn stover, feasibly, onto other products from switchgrass and miscanthus that are being researched in the ethanol side, to algae on the oil side is another one that's out there. And so really there's a lot of mind power at work all across the country in participation both in the public sector and the private sector. And certainly you know, the state of Georgia has been a part of that. I was with U.S. Senator Saxby Chambliss here a few weeks ago, and you know, we're very excited about a lot of the mind power that is working on different alternatives. Which one is going to end up being the winner, we don't know yet, but it needs research, and it needs to happen now.
I'd just like to make one more statement on the political will of the country. The political will of the country has to stay focused on creating the alternative fuel sources for this country. Regardless of the cost today, we have to finish the drill as people kind of talked back about years ago in the late 70s and early 80s. So I think the political will is there, and we'll finish the drill this time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Senator. Go ahead.
Could
Sorry.
I
Oh,
comment?
absolutely, Bill. I'm sorry.
I think one of the nice things that Jim Woolsey's presentation said is it is about security, but it is also about CO2. And I think when we do need to keep some sort of a focus on two items, which is more difficult. And as we look at ethanol and the form that we're getting the ethanol from, I think that once we put in place a lot of plants, those plants are not just going to be shut down. So what we do have to be careful about is looking at, as we build these plants, they'll be around for 30 years, and if they're not being done in the most efficient way, then there's some question about the wisdom of that. And what I believe is if you look at the carbon footprint of ethanol, depending on how it's created, relative to a regular hydrocarbon fuel, it's not so clear that that addresses the CO2 part of the picture in a way that's very wise, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, we live in a world of choices, and I don't think there's a lot of ways to go after this problem, and somebody brought up the mass transit, and we do have a limited amount of resources, so the cost does matter. I mean, it's not regardless of cost, at least in my opinion. And I think, if you think about conservation versus ethanol and just try to put some numbers to it, the gasoline pool is 150 billion gallons. If we could conserve 10% of the gasoline pool by mass transit, by lighter vehicles, that would be 15 billion gallons, which right now we're at 6 or 7 billion gallons of ethanol. 15 billion gallons of ethanol requires 5 billion bushels of corn. And if you get 150 to 157 bushels of corn per acre, that's a lot of acres. I think it's 20 million. I'm trying to do the math in my head. It's 10 or 20 million acres. And, cultivating 10 or 20 million acres is not a minor issue. You got to fertilize it, which takes natural gas. You got to process it, the ethanol plants. So I'm not arguing against ethanol, but I do think there are lots of ways to try to skin the cat. And it's up to us to try to pick the most efficient, effective ways to do that.
Did you want to add to that, Nick? Yeah.
Steve wanted to mention.
I know Steve did.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, we've talked about diversity of feedstock. We've talked about coal and oil shale and biofuels, and there's a tendency to want to lump, say, cellulosic ethanol into one slot. But when you look at it more closely, there's a very wide range of feedstock. Some will be easier to process than others. And so developing the sources which are the easiest to process, identifying those, developing those, I think is going to be one of the main challenges, but whoever does that, it's going to be very rewarding. For example, there's this fascination with switchgrass, but if you look at the composition of switchgrass, it can contain several hundred ppm of sulfur, okay? So it's not a clean feed. So how are you going to handle that sulfur? I mean, these are all challenges that need to be overcome if we're going to develop any of these feedstocks for ethanol or other biofuels.
All right. Any others before we move on? Go ahead and tell us your name and where you're from.
Virginia Persons with Smith Barney here in Atlanta. One thing I'm wondering about in the production of ethanol, whether you're talking about corn-based or cellulosic, I know it requires a great deal of water, but relatively speaking, I'm not sure how much. And so I'm wondering, can you quantify for me, are we trading one resource problem for another resource problem, or relatively speaking, is the amount of water not something that we should be worried about?
We should be worried about water tremendously. There isn't enough water now. Fresh water, to produce fresh water will cost, depending on if it's done the most efficient way, 2.2 kilowatt hours per cubic meter. If it's done inefficiently, 73 kilowatt hours per cubic meter. So water, energy, and CO2 are linked. It's not possible to de-link them. In terms of the efficiency and how that is linked to the production of ethanol, Steve and I were just talking last night. He has some figures that might shock people. I was interested in the process cost in terms of water, but I think you might want to comment on the actual growing, the overall life cycle associated with that, and it's shocking.
Well, I'm a corn farmer. I grow corn in my backyard, and I also travel a lot, so when I travel in the summer, I always tell my wife, be sure and water the corn while I'm gone. I saw, I wasn't sure how much water I use, but I saw a number just recently that it takes over 1,000 gallons of water. If you look at the whole cycle, growing the corn, processing everything, over 1,000 gallons of water for each gallon of ethanol that you produce.
I had done some research as well, and I had 17. This is coming out of a Cornell ecology professor, a gentleman named David Pimentel. 1,700 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of ethanol. Manufacturing process alone takes 3.5 gallons to 5 gallons. Does that sound right? No?
Can I
Absolutely.
jump in and comment?
Absolutely.
And these gentlemen have brought up some key points. Water certainly is important, but I'm definitely going to disagree with the gentleman that you just referenced. He is the one study in 11 studies that finds corn ethanol to be not energy positive. And today, we say, as an industry, we're roughly 33% energy positive. He is the one of the 11 that finds otherwise, okay? Did you want to jump in after? Okay. So to finish out, I guess, what I did want to mention was in the actual production of corn into a gallon of ethanol, our facilities are roughly 3 gallons of water used per gallon of ethanol produced. Now, that's just from the time the corn gets dumped in the facility, and this isn't the water all over. But if I could just jot this in perspective, these are numbers off the EPA's website. And just to put it in perspective, 1,851 gallons of water to refine a 42-gallon barrel of oil. So when you take that down to a per-gallon basis, that's over 10 times the amount of water in a gallon of gasoline or crude oil per gallon of ethanol.
Okay.
1,500 gallons of water to process 1 barrel of beer. Thought that was interesting.
Gotta have priorities.
You know, and there are some others that maybe aren't as relevant, but you know, some others come to mind. 1 gallon to process a quarter pound hamburger. 24 gallons to produce a pound of plastic. So, you know, water is important, and certainly in the ethanol industry, we do use water in the process, but keep everything in perspective. And I guess the last note I'll mention on that is we currently have facilities that are being built that are complete zero process, all of our facilities are complete zero process discharge, meaning any water that comes into contact with the mash, the enzymes, is not discharged. But we actually have a few that are spending additional equipment in a new technology. It's roughly a $10 to $15 million capital expenditure up front. They will not discharge any water. All their water will be reused, and any of those minerals or elements that come in with the water out of the ground are then removed with this equipment, and it's basically a sludge-like material. And so as an industry, we continue to work, and that number has come down. And so when Mr. Pimentel mentions 3.5 to 5 gallons, that's old news. That's old statistics, and that's what you'll find in other areas of the study. The industry has come a long ways since 1990, since 1995, since 2000. Our energy usage on a per-gallon basis, natural gas that we guarantee, used to be 38,000 BTUs per gallon of ethanol just 3 years ago. Today that's 32,000, and a lot of those plants are operating under 30,000. And so as an industry, as the technology providers, as the builders, we're constantly trying to improve the process that we have.
All right,
Mr. Woolsey?
Go ahead.
Excuse me. I wanted just to bring out, I don't have a problem with the water used in production. I think the concern is again the point I was making before. If you're making millions of barrels a day, you're not going to be doing that with beer, hopefully. So you're not going to be drawing down the aquifers in the Midwest to make beer. And I think it's the only point I was trying to make is we need to be very conscious of water supply when we're talking about growing something that we're going to depend on day in, day out to make millions of barrels. So if there's a drought, too bad. We need that fuel for our vehicles, and so we need to be very conscious that the fuels we develop take that into account. That's the point I'm trying to make. On Pimentel, I agree his numbers are off. I was aware of the number you mentioned. That's why I cut back on it, because I think he always exaggerates, and that's why I cut back to 1,000, which is probably not far from what it takes to actually grow corn.
All right. Go ahead, Jim.
I just want to stress that in an article in Science magazine a year ago, January, 4 distinguished professors in this area, led, I think, by Professor Kamen of Berkeley, as far as I'm concerned, utterly destroyed Mr. Pimentel's studies. And I think anybody who quotes Mr. Pimentel ought to look back at Professor Kamen's and the others' work in Science magazine. The second thing is with respect to water use or anything else about growing corn. We ought to realize that we grew close to 100 million acres of corn last year, 95 or so. About 10% of that went to food for humans directly, corn on the cob. About 20% of it went to ethanol. Some 70% went for other uses, most of it for animal feed, and a very large share of that, it's not just feed for chickens and so forth, but goes for feeding corn to cattle. Now, cattle do not naturally eat corn. They don't like corn. They get sick when they eat corn. There's only one reason to jam corn into cattle, and that is if the government has a cardiovascular surgery support program. If you want to make sure that the meat is fat, because grass-fed cattle steaks, believe me, taste just fine, but if you want to make sure you got plenty of fat in your meat, you feed corn to cattle. So if the government wanted to move away slightly from its cardiovascular surgery support program and use some of that acreage for ethanol, personally, I think we'd be better off.
Go over here. Oh, by all means. Tell us your name and where you're from.
I'm Stacy Williams from Washburn. And I've been reading about genetically engineered plants and trees that are designed to break down more easily. And I was wondering if you could speak about how that's going to influence the fermentation process, especially the pretreatment section of the process. And when are these types of plants going to influence the availability of alternative fuels?
That goes exactly, as you said, to the front end of this pretreatment issue and the, quote, recalcitrance of cellulosic biofuels. And it boils down to we don't know. But I think the focus of this Oak Ridge-led group, which Georgia Tech is participating, UGA is participating in, basically that is the focus of this, to try to essentially re-engineer the plant. You have to be very careful. There can be unintended consequences. If you make it less recalcitrant, you also make it more vulnerable to attack by the surroundings. So I really don't know the answer to that, but it's a quest we have to follow. And so I don't know if there's other comments.
All right, go ahead. Thank you very much. Tell us your name and where you're from.
Yes, my name is Jacques Davignon. I'm the president of Surf Technologies here in Atlanta, Georgia. And my question kind of follows the economic line that the gentleman with the hedge fund mentioned. kind of in regard to Mr. Woolsey's comments related to distribution of the generating capability. Ethanol is one answer, or actually it's one alternative to oil, but if you look strictly at distributing generation to where it's used, it might be something more along the lines of solar power or wind power, in which case you could have the ultimate consumer have their own generating capability right there. The problem would be, from an economic standpoint, that hedge funds and companies like Chevron would not be able to meter the use of the wind or the sun that was generating the power. And therefore, it wouldn't be as an attractive answer to this country's problem with the use of oil in generation and in driving our cars, and therefore probably wouldn't get as much research focus as, say, something as ethanol. And I think we could all debate whether ethanol actually reduces the carbon footprint or increases it. But along that line, I'd also be interested in how energy efficient the plants were. Would you use some of those other alternatives like solar and wind in designing your plant so that you don't have to use carbon fuels to generate yet another kind of fuel? And in closing, I guess the one thing I'd say about your EPA numbers is that those are the same people that told me how many miles per gallon that my Toyota would get when I bought it, and they were off by a significant percentage. So from a statistics standpoint, I think we can all here find statistics to support our argument. But I'd be interested to know what you think about a fuel that really could be free and there is no consumption, sort of like Steve Jobs' iPhone. He got to sell the iPhone, which is cool. He charged everybody a lot for it, but what's really cool is AT&T gets to charge you every time you pick it up and use it.
Go ahead. All right, I'll start with you, Tom.
You know, again, it goes back to choices, and we have a problem, and actually the solar is a separate issue from transportation fuels, because at least we've got a long ways to go to get to electric-powered, solar-powered cars. But assuming for a minute you don't have that, so the problem we have is that carbon-based fuels are very cheap. Oil's cheap, coal's cheap, and so we built a huge economy based on very cheap energy, and we abuse it, and we overuse it, and we waste it. And so what we're faced with is, how do we move from there to something better? And we have this array of technologies, from solar to, which is good for electricity, to ethanol, to gas liquids from natural gas. And it's really all about trying to sort all this stuff out and picking the right policies to attack the problem. And for instance, if you take photovoltaic solar, it's 22 cents, at least my knowledge, 22 cents a kilowatt hour to produce it. From that, you can do coal for probably 4 cents. Now it's there. So now what I think is very appropriate for the government to do, and which it is doing, is subsidize some of these things to see if they can bring them down the cost curve. And what we should be very aware and careful of is that they do, in fact, come down the cost curve. And 5 years from now, we're not doing, like the young lady said, subsidizing a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't work. And so it is about trying a whole bunch of different things under public policy, having a feedback loop to make sure they're working and they are coming down at cost, and then make intelligent adjustments along the way. And I think that's what we are doing to a certain degree.
Relative to the plant and using some of those other technologies, I guess the part that I could comment on is we have looked at wind generation on the plants to serve that electricity need, particularly in the areas of northwestern Iowa, southwestern Minnesota have great wind potential. What we found to be a deterring factor there is the interconnect fee. That plant needs electricity 24/7, and when the wind's not blowing, if the utility is still charging that entity a certain 3 to 5 cents, whatever it might be, fee, whether it's on or off, it doesn't make sense for these plants. They can't afford to interconnect that turbine into their facility. I would say, just rough average numbers, a lot of our facilities are paying probably in that 5-cent range per kilowatt hour for their electricity. And that's, I guess, just maybe the nature of where they are. Certainly quite a few of them are in Nebraska, which has the cheapest electricity. Now, if these were in California at 12 or 14 cents, or maybe it's even more, I don't know. But we have looked at that, particularly in these sectors of the country where we've got plants and there is a lot of wind capacity, and that has been, so far, the factor that has kept that away.
Thank you. Hey, John, tell me your name and where you're from.
Yes, Jonathan Goldman here from Atlanta, Suniva Incorporated. I guess first comment is I guess I'd have to be Homer Simpson if I could dream about a land where the cars run on beer. But I wanted to revisit a point made earlier about the sugar cane. It sounded like the limitation was embedded in the subsidy structure, that farmers weren't incented to grow sugar cane for ethanol, perhaps because the subsidies just incent them to grow it for food. If that's true, is there something that can be done from a policy point of view to change that? And similarly or analogously, could that also have an impact on ethanol if there's something that's changed relative to the policy and the subsidies in the corn area?
And I can start there because I was one that commented on that earlier. John, I would be the first to admit I don't understand every implication of how that sugar industry unfolds in the United States past the fact that those economics make it cost-effective in Brazil, but not in the United States. What I can say is there are other factors. I think when we look at Brazil and how it's produced, I'm not certain that we could take that exact process and have that in a plant in the United States and still pass air emissions and permitting per our standards. And I just think there's some things that would need to be explored, and like I said, I don't have a deep knowledge there. Relative to the 51-cent subsidy tax credit for ethanol, that's in place to really drive the folks to absorb that supply, to blend that product. It's not there to really drive, I guess I would argue, it's not there to drive the supply or build more plants. It's there to eat up that demand and put that fuel to use. And really what we're seeing right now is a classic example of ethanol, pure ethanol, going from roughly $2 a gallon, and I guess maybe back up. When MTB phased out, ethanol was, soared. Parts of New York Harbor over $4 a gallon because there was immediate need and really only one alternative for those folks at that time, as I understand. We were in a period there where ethanol traded in the $2 to $2.20 range, and in the last 3 months, that price has been driven down to $1.55, $1.60. And so all of a sudden we don't have ethanol being priced off of its petroleum value, but rather the leverage of what I guess I'm just going to, for lack of a better term, call big oil, the leverage of those folks to push that to near break-even levels and pricing that ethanol relative to what corn price is and where those plants can break even. And so I think that 51-cent tax credit is important in the sense that it drives folks to use that product. As we've branched out and gone from a 5 to 7 billion gallon industry, and now in a few years approaching 15, where we most likely will stop from corn to ethanol, there is infrastructure that needs to be built, particularly in the regions that have high populations. And we're seeing just that. With this over $1 discretionary blending margin in the Southeast, in New York, out in the West, we have seen folks, and I guess the CSX and Norfolk Southern were just talking about this a week or two ago at a supply conference. Folks are finding creative ways to get this product into those terminals. And a real issue here is, of all the blending terminals in the United States, a significant portion of them aren't on a rail line. And so since ethanol, the majority of it is coming out of the Midwest, do they have access to the product? And that's another key element.
Thank you.
I'm getting back to your question on sugar cane. That goes back to the water issue. It takes a lot of water to grow sugar cane, which is why it's only grown in certain parts of the country like Louisiana, which actually raises two issues. One is it's a technology challenge then to come up with a type of sugar cane that would be just as productive but could be grown with much less water. That's doable. So that's something that industry needs to work on. The second is getting back to energy security. We don't necessarily need to grow everything in this country if we can develop secure sources. And so we've talked about Brazil, other parts of the world. As long as we maintain our energy security, we don't necessarily have to grow everything in the U.S.
All right. I think that about wraps it up. I'd like to thank Bill and Steve and Nick and Tom and, of course, all of you for coming. It's been a pleasure to have you. Have a safe trip home.